Good afternoon. Uh, Thank you. Welcome, everyone, to the first lecture of the Center for Humanities and the Public Sphere Speaker Series this year, Scales of Belonging. I'm very happy to see so many friendly faces in this audience. My name is Jamie Alberg. I'm the new Rothman Chair and Director of the Center for Humanities and the Public Sphere in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences at the University of Florida. And this is the very first public event of my term as director. So I'm very excited to be here with you today. Thank you. This academic year, our series has been supported by a number of generous donors and co-sponsors. So I want to start by recognizing them. We have the Margaret and Robert Rothman Endowment, the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, the Bob Graham Center for Public Service, the Center for Arts, Migration, and Entrepreneurship, the African American Studies Program, the Departments of Anthropology, History, Political Science, and Geography, Smathers Libraries, where we are now, and UF Research. And I would also like to thank the staff of the Center for Humanities in the Public Sphere. And if they're not too embarrassed, ask them to stand when I recognize them so that you know who they are as well. They work very hard to bring events like this to you. So I would like to start with Sarah Agnelli, our Assistant Director of Graduate Engagement. Sarah. Our Program Manager, Noah Mullins. Where's Noah? And our Office Manager, Rhonda Black. Thanks, guys. We're going to be recording the event today with an eye to making it more widely available in the future. So please do keep that in mind as we move forward. And we are in for a treat with the first distinguished lecturer in our speaker series, Professor Dipesh Chakrabarty from the University of Chicago. Our speaker today is going to be introduced by UF's very own Vasudha Narayanan, Distinguished Professor from the Department of Religion, and a nationally and internationally known scholar, including as past president of the American Academy of Religion. So I'm just going to say a few words about her, and then she will step up and Dipesh can get started. So Professor Narayanan is the author of or editor of 7 books and numerous articles, book chapters, and encyclopedia entries in research areas that span the Hindu traditions in India, Cambodia, and America, visual and expressive cultures in the study of the Hindu traditions, and gender issues as they affect how we think about religion. Her work has been supported by numerous grants and fellowships from several organizations, including, just as examples, the American Council of Learned Societies, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Guggenheim Foundation, the American Institute of Indian Studies, Smithsonian, the Social Science Research Council. She was president of the Society for Hindu-Christian Studies from 1996 to 1998, and named, in the midst of all of that, University of Florida's Teacher Scholar of the Year in 2010. Just this year, she's been elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. So please join me in welcoming Professor Narayanan.
Thank you. Namaste and good afternoon. It's a pleasure and an honor to introduce Dr. Dipesh Chakrabarty, Lawrence A. Kimpton, Distinguished Service Professor of History in South Asian Languages and Civilization at the University of Chicago. Professor Dipesh Chakrabarty is someone who, in a different era and in a different time, in a different place, and I'm rewinding here to the Catholic school and the Irish nuns, Professor Dipesh Chakrabarty would have been called a Renaissance man. The irony of this phrase, in using this phrase, is obvious to all of us here. The ideal embraced notions of the Renaissance humanism, which considered man, a human being, at the center of the universe. It also indicated one who who should try his skills in all areas of knowledge. And it is in this sense, and I use the phrase when I talk about Professor Dipesh Chakrabarty. His academic credentials, his undergrad, are truly fit this notion of one aspect of the Renaissance man. His undergraduate major was in physics. His immediate postgraduate work was in the business school in the Calcutta, in the prestigious Indian Institute of Management, Calcutta, and his PhD is in history from the Australian National University. Professor Chakrabarty's recent work makes a crucial difference between planet and the globe. However, the category of planet comes from two ideas that use the word globe. One is globalization, that is, how we human beings have come to engage with the idea of the globe, something that Professor Chakrabarty says does not involve does not involve deep time. Rather, it's not more than a few centuries old. I think you said 500 at one point. The other way is how we use it, how you use the term is like in global warming. And Professor Chakrabarty's writing take us on an intellectual path to the idea of the planet. I love the observation of Professor Jennifer Pitts, professor of political science in the University of Chicago. As a humanist concerned with about rights and justice, and that's one of the most important parts of his writing, he feels as though he has fallen into deep history in facing the shock of recognition of the otherness of the planet. This concern of deep time is fascinating. As Professor Chakrabarty says, what if the landscape itself is in crisis? Seas rising to submerge or thoughts ravaging the land, or droughts ravaging the land, species facing extinction and needs to be foregrounded. In fact, I love that picture that you had of the couple in front of the cliffs. In the crisis of the Anthropocene, the prospect of inhabiting a less habitable planet, that which usually is relegated to the background, the work of deep time intrudes into our present, asking what has made the earth less habitable entails an engagement with deep time. It shines a light on us being tossed about between different scales of time, and that fits into our series here, and forces us to think about what some scientists call the Deborah's number, which is a field of rheology, not theology, but rheology. Deborah's number quantifies the notion that given enough time, even solid material things like mountains flow. Comes from Judges 5:5, where Deborah, the prophetess, says, the mountains flow before the Lord. So it's a scale of time that he's talking about. And, or to draw from Hindu texts, the Puranas, the cycles of creation and destruction may take 100 quadrillion years, give or take. Professor Chakrabarty takes us on a fascinating journey through many stories, the planet, the globe, the foregrounded human being, ideas of mutual giving and taking, and whether we have a sense of awe, of reverence in looking at the earth. His work engages many of us in the social sciences and the humanities. And the work on what a religious experience boldly pushes the horizon, which boldly pushes the horizons of Buber and William James's, and it seeks a way of combining wonderment and reverence. All this done with intellectual vigor and rigor and aesthetic delight. And we hear the voices of physicists, philosophers, poets, and Tagore illumines many a distinction, many a discussion. And yet, there are many questions to ask, and I'm sure we'll get to these soon. Professor Chakrabarty, you started with provincializing Europe, and the scales exploded to the planet from Europe. And we hope the next stop, the next book, is on the scales of belonging larger. That is, it belonging a galactic whole. So I wondered why Jamie had asked me to introduce Professor Chakrabarty, and I finally figured it out last night. My name, Vasudha, means earth. So thank you very much.
Okay, thanks. Yeah. Is this volume all right? You can hear me? Okay. So thank you everybody for coming. I'm deeply honored by your presence, deeply honored by the invitation to start off this series on scales of belonging. And I've been I arrived yesterday and I've been having a wonderful time with everybody at the center, with other colleagues, students, the leaders of the center, Jamie and Sarah. So delighted to be here. I was here, I think, back in 2001, when Mark Turner used to teach Latin American history in the history department. And I had a funny exchange with the young man at the reception in the hotel, and he said, "Have you stayed here before?" I said, "No, I don't think I have." And and then I said to him, "Well, the last time I was in town was 2001." And he said, "Many things have changed." And I said, "Probably including you." And I was close enough, wrong by 5 years, he said. But it's great to be back. And Chicago is just starting to get cold. So this has also prolonged my summer. I'm very grateful for that. And so just what about the title and a few prefatory remarks, and then I'll hide behind the computers and let the slides do the talking with my being a voiceover. New philosophical anthropology. So philosophical anthropology was obviously the expression that Kant used. And I came to this idea of since I was working on climate change, as I was finishing my first book on climate change, which came out in 2021, I always kept asking myself, what is it that I am doing with climate change? I'm a humanist historian. I'm not a geologist. I'm not a stratigrapher. So what am I doing? And I finally found the answer to, and I'm not am I an activist or a policymaker. So I found the answer in reading Kant's Introduction to Logic, where he basically said that if you have a big problem, a really major problem, and I was convinced by then this is a major problem, he said there are three questions to be asked. And I could figure out that none of them were my questions, or for me to ask. One is, what is the problem? And by the time I came into this problem, the scientists, the IPCC was set up in 1988. The scientists had been working on global warming. Initially, they had a theory of global cooling. And so they had defined the problem. They had defined what determined the climate of this whole planet and what global warming was. So, okay, so if you ask, what is the problem? You go to the scientists. what should be done about it? What is to be done? The Leninist question. And again, as I said, I'm not a policymaker, and nor am I an activist. But these people had been to the problem before I went there. So by the time I was thinking about it, economists had basically shifted everything they had learned or taught themselves in studying risks. And they had basically shifted all their toolkit to deal with risks, to study climate change, because they were thinking of climate change as yet another risk. And therefore, the debates were already about whether you have a maximal principle or what kind of things do you do. So a lot of debates about climate denialists, often the argument was, at least it's a risk, so we should do things that we do in facing a risk. And of course, activists had all kinds of propositions, get rid of capitalism, degrowth. So there were people who had answered the problem in some ways. What do we do? The third question is, what do we expect from the problem? What to expect? Partly, if you read the IPCC reports, the impacts volume, the volume in which they talk about what will be the impact of climate change, that helps you to visualize. Filmmakers had already sort of from the 90s been producing kind of, dystopic views of the world of LA, and sort of beginning with Terminator and RoboCop and all those sorts of films. So you go to art, as Kant also said, you go to art and religion. Are we in an apocalypse? Is this the end time that has come, right? So those are questions that come from the repertoire of religion. So, and Kant said, if you ask what to expect, you go to religion, you go to art. But, so none of these questions were mine. So what do I do? And then Kant saved me by saying that all these questions fold into another large question, which is, what is the human being? So basically, he said, when there's a really major problem that humanity faces, it gives you an opportunity to stocktake and go back and ask yourself, are we still the same kind of entity that we thought we were? So it's a kind of renewal of that question. What assumptions do we make about human beings? From what point of view do we think of human beings? So it's really in kind of trying to answer that question that I eventually developed a distinction between the globe and the planet, which I will talk about, which will be the main burden of my talk. But again, that was not where I started. So, by the way, what I'm trying to do here is partly recap what I've done in my 2 books. The last one came out this year in July. So the first book is called getting old. The Climate of History in a Planetary Age. That's the first book as well. And the book that's just come out is called One Planet, Many Worlds, The Climate Parallax. So when I started, I got interested in climate change around 2003. Jimmy, will you watch the time and kind of give me a warning at 45 minutes or so? And then I'll make sure that I just don't go over by much. So so you see, the climate talk had been going on. And it was in 1987 that James Hansen, who was then the head of the Goddard Center in NASA, spoke to American politicians about climate change when George Bush, the senior Bush, said he was going to deal with the greenhouse effect with the White House effect. And then 1988 is when IPCC was set up. So people like myself who write history absolutely took no notice of the IPCC and what was going on, so much so that a respected historian, Charles Meyer, at Harvard, wrote an article for American Historical Review in the year 2000, saying goodbye to the century. It was called Consigning the 20th Century to History. And if you look at it, there's everything in it, major developments, up, positive, negative, fascism, wars, Marxism, decolonization, but not a word about climate change. And that's 12 years after IPCC had been set up. And politicians were discussing global warming. if you go to the library and look at popular books on globalization and global warming, they all begin to come out from the early 1990s. But people like myself were not reading global warming. We were talking about whatever we were talking about, but not climate change. And I got interested because in 2003, there were some horrible fires in the Australian capital city of Canberra, and I did my PhD there, and that's where I it was in Australia that a bit like your development, I came to love the outdoors. I mean, we're not very outdoorsy people in Calcutta, right?
Yeah.
So, and all the outdoors I loved, all those spots got gutted. And I proudly took a Bengali friend to look at one of these spots thinking it was still the same. And it looked like a scene from Mad Max. And I was in grief. I thought, what happened to the places I loved? And I knew, having been in Australia for 20 years, that the gum trees need natural fire for their own renewal. And there was a drought going on, but all my Australian friends who worked on the environment and stuff said to me, Dipesh, this is not an ordinary drought, this is climate change. And I said, what's climate change? That's 2003. That got me thinking. And I began to read up. And the first thing that was like a mini explosion in my, as Professor Narayan was saying, thank you, by the way, for those warm and humbling words. The scientists were actually saying that humanity, thanks to our numbers, animals we keep, our technology, had themselves become a geological agent, changing the history of the planet. And they were basing this on a new science called Earth System Science, which evolved out of Cold War. We can talk about it later. I mean, it's young. It's quite young because it was only in 1983 that the NASA set up its first subcommittee on Earth System Science. But the basic proposition was, and I didn't understand it then, was that on this planet, you can't separate geology from biology. That geology and biology are processes that work together to support life on this planet. And that's why the planet, we have oxygen because we have life. We have more minerals because of the oxidation processes. So this planet has more minerals than planets without life. So in an interesting way, so they talked about a system in the singular, but it came out of Cold War. It came out of space competition, all those things we can come back to. But what was fascinating for me was for them to say that humanity in that kind of complex had become a geological force or a geological agent. And mind you, I come from lefty social history where the word agent in English is a very interesting word because the word agent arises in the sphere of commerce, like a shipping agency, a legal agency. Agent is somebody who speaks for you. And then it undergoes transformation in the 20th century where agent becomes the person who speaks for themselves. So it's kind of comes to stand for your individual autonomy, that, give agency to so-and-so in historiography, right? That's what it meant. And my colleague in the geophysics division, David Archer, who wrote a book explaining climate change, where he said, our impact on the planet was similar to the impact of the asteroid that struck the planet and wiped off the dinosaurs. He said that is the kind of, so we're not just a physical force. You could imagine, he was inviting me to imagine humanity and its complex technology and everything together being a thing. And that I thought kind of put a bomb under all the assumptions on which my discipline, history, rested. And one of the assumptions was the separation of natural history from human history. And there are good reasons for it. One reason, of course, one set of reasons was elaborated in the 1930s in Oxford, when the philosopher of history and the archaeologist, Robin Collingwood, R.G. Collingwood, had debates with philosophers of science like Alfred Whitehead. Or there was an Australian philosopher in Oxford called Sam Alexander, who were claiming that, I mean, later on, J.B.S. Haldane, who wrote a book called Everything Has a History, would argue that the world is only historical. And what we consider history in the history departments is only one branch of a larger history that is happening all the time, slow and fast at different paces. And Collingwood was very upset about it because Sam Alexander wrote an essay then called The Historicity of Things. And Collingwood got very upset and said, humans are not things. He said, things have chronology, only humans have history, because humans choose between good and bad. Humans debate issues. And it's absurd to say that humans are a thing. And I had grown up on that assumption. So I knew that rivers existed. I mean, even Brodel, the great French historian, when he was introducing nature into human history, was still assumed that natural cycles were slow and they repeated themselves. The seasons came and went. And therefore, it affected what humanity did, but it was not human history. And this was the first time I saw that assumption being exploded. So I got very interested. And, like Shayantika here, my first language is Bengali. I grew up in Calcutta to have Bengali as my first language. My family didn't even think that I would leave the country and not be a good Bengali son to my parents. And I write in Bengali. And so what I did was, first thing I did was, I thought, oh dear, this assumption has been exploded. And I thought through some of the consequences of the undermining of the assumption. And I wrote up a Bengali essay, which was published. It had the subtitle, "For Thesis." And none of my Bengali friends were interested. Some people said to me, these are white people's problems. Why are you thinking about? I went to Bangladesh, Dhaka, and people said, Dipesh Da, meaning older brother, Dipesh, he said, you become white. And I said, Shada hoye gechen. I said, yeah, Bill, I've been living there for decades now. It's entirely possible that somewhere I've become white. And so I came back to Chicago, and I was on the board of Critical Inquiry. And Tom Mitchell, who was the editor, he came to me and said, do you have something you can give to the journal? And I said, yeah, there's this article. Let me write it up in English. So I expanded, wrote it up in English, and came out as my first article, 2009, called The Climate of History for Thesis. And boom, I was being attacked left, right, and center by everybody saying, why you talk about the species? Why you talk about Anthropocene and not Capitalocene? And not every human being is responsible. It got translated. Friends in India were not interested. And in some respects, it's interesting to think why the Anglosphere or outside the Anglosphere, the Europeans or the Latin Americans were. And that's when this journey started. And the moment they attacked me, I kept answering their arguments back. I was not happy. I knew that I was not happy saying it's just capitalism. I felt it was something more. And as I was thinking through that, there was a French philosopher, there is, Catherine Malabou, and I met with her, and she had written something on my English article. And it was she who said to me, I was kind of floundering. I think, yeah, I knew that the word globe in global warming and the word globe in globalization did not mean the same thing. But I did not come to that thought with this kind of a clarity until Catherine Malabou wrote it, and then we met, and she said to me in person, you realize, Dipesh, that the word globe in global warming and the word globe in globalization are two different things. And that's when the penny dropped. And eventually, the second globe for me became the planet, the Earth system. And so I'm going to run through a series of distinctions between globe and global warming, but beginning by saying that it's not a binary distinction, because I was arguing that it is the crisis of globalization or the intensification of globalization that actually made the planet visible and brought it into the domain of everyday news. So now, for instance, the expression excess carbon dioxide in the atmosphere everybody would probably be familiar with it. Sometimes in classroom, I'd ask students, do you know this expression, excess carbon dioxide in the atmosphere? And they'd say, yeah, we do. And then I'd say, okay, so excess in respect to what? And sometimes they would fumble on it because they hadn't thought about that. So it's in excess of the rate at which the natural carbon sinks can absorb carbon dioxide, right? So, but the fact is, when you come across these expressions, you're learning about how the planet works. You're learning geological facts, which you normally wouldn't learn. Not just the warming of the seas, but the acidification of the seas. Not just the acidification of the seas, the destruction of species in the sea, right? So fundamentally, I realized that the globe describes what European empires and the rise of capitalism, global markets, technologies did for us, which is to make this thing called the planet into the habitat for humanity and connect us. And that is really a 500-year-old history, European expansion. And also, it's a history, very human-centered history, because humans made the globe. They are the protagonists of globalization or even imperialism. And therefore, humans are at the center of this story. But when the scientists were trying to explain why we are upsetting the climate, why weather is becoming erratic, what keeps the climate in place, they were telling a much larger story. Like the story of the oxygen in the air is a much larger story. And in that story, like if you're a geologist who thinks about humanity in terms of the context of the history of the planet, or if you're an evolutionary biologist who thinks of human beings evolving, let's say out of the primate group of animals, then you, in both of these subjects, humans come so late in the story that it's impossible to put humans at the center of the story. So these are branches of science which decenter humans in their narratives. And I realized that globe is a human-centered conception. The globe of globalization. But the globe of global warming, which is what I'm calling a planet, is a conception that decenters humans. So I'll just quickly go through these distinctions. If something seems difficult, we can come back to it. But where the scientists helped, these Earth system scientists eventually. So there are a lot of debates, right? People are saying this is happening because of capitalism. So you ask, how old is capitalism? So some people say 500 years. Then some people say, no, it's the Industrial Revolution. Some people said, no, it's the European expansion into the Latin America and the colonization and actually decimation of many indigenous societies. That is the beginning of the Anthropocene. So there are many, but what was extremely helpful was that these scientists worked with historians, including John McNeill, who is a very respected environmental historian, to actually show that the real changes in human society that actually brings about a lot of the current crisis begin from the 1950s. So the critical part of this history is more recent history. History from the end of the Second World War. Now, okay, so this is what they call the Great Acceleration. And so they basically, these scientists produced graphs of two colors, orange colored graphs, which are about, so really what's happening with human institutions, human numbers. So if you look at them, so humanity is meant, what, 300,000 years old, they say. It took us almost 300,000 years to get to the number 1 billion. So in 1900, we were 1.6 billion. Boom, in 2000, we were 1.6 billion. Now we're 8, going on to 9 or 10. So it suddenly expands. Real GDP, foreign direct investment. So if you look at all the graphs, you see that vertical line, that's 1950. So that's where it grows exponentially. And if you actually could resolve these graphs, you will find that once China and India enter, really China becomes a big economic power, they become even steeper. It's interesting to remember, we talk about fossil fuels, 87% of the fossil fuel that humans have used, 87% have been used after 1950. So the next set of graphs actually, it breaks it down into the contribution of the OECD countries, the developing countries, but they all contribute to this process. And then they had this blue set of graphs. And these are basically graphs showing how the planet responds to what humans have done. So so whether you look at carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, methane are the three most important, powerful greenhouse gases. And of course, you know that without some greenhouse gases, there wouldn't be life. It would just, planet would be too cold. So we need them. And the other one is water vapor. It's not there. The stratospheric ozone is actually measuring the depletion in the ozone layer, right? And they all go up at the same time. So at least you can see that visually there's a correlation. So again, the vertical line is 1950. And so let me also add some facts to it. So since 2007 is the year when more than half of humans began to live in cities. So the prediction is that by the end of this century, humanity will mainly be a city-dwelling species. Also an aging species, perhaps, because the numbers will go up and then come down. The other interesting facts are, so certain surveys have shown that human consumption, so the number of people who actually consume consumer goods, like buying cars, buying other gadgets, everything, computers. So if you think of them as consumers, it was in 1986 that we had 1 billion consumers. Now we have about between 4 and 5 billion consumers. So you can easily say 3 billion human beings live badly, very badly. But let's say between 4 and 5 billion human beings, not in terms of quality of life, but in terms of consumption, are better off. And the interesting fact is that every second billion has been added faster than the previous billion. And the other important fact is that in 2000, 75% of the consumption came from the developed countries. Now the share of the developed countries in consumption is 35%. So 65% of the consumption is by the Chinese, Indian, African, new middle classes that have joined the euphoria of consumption. If you think of life expectancy, so one major, of course, the contribution to sustaining humans in large numbers, public health regimes from 19th century to the invention of antibiotics in the 1920s. And antibiotics played a major role in saving lives during the Second World War, and of course later too. There's an interesting story there of actually antibiotics producing antibiotic-resistant bacteria. So one of the interesting things about the bacterial world and the microbial world is that whatever you put in there, whatever you put there to stop them becomes their pathway of evolution. But that's a different story. I was talking about a geologist at Duke, Peter Haff, who came up with the idea of a technosphere, where he said, look, you have to imagine this planet as not only having a rocky surface, like a lithosphere, then the biosphere where life lives, then atmosphere, stratosphere. He said, you have to imagine a thin film of technosphere, the technology that connects this planet together, everything that connects us. His argument was, if we didn't have technosphere, then human population would crash to somewhere close to 11 million. And now we are about 8 billion. So he was saying biology has become dependent on technology, right? This technology keeps us alive. And therefore, we need to keep the technology alive. And the upshot has been that human lifespan is Montesquieu, who once said that the objective of politics is to expand human lifespan. So in the 18th century, they said that average lifespan was 30 years. Now it's more than double that figure. So if climate change was not happening, then really the guru I was saying of this age would be somebody like Steve Pinker from Harvard, who's always writing books saying how well off we are and we should be proud of what science. And he's not untrue, but when I was reading his book called Enlightenment Now, and he gives many graphs showing this progress in human affairs, these are exactly the graphs of great acceleration. So if you read William McNeill and the book on great acceleration and Steve Pinker, you can see the same graphs. But if you forget about climate change, it looks like the story of human well-being altogether. The other thing to notice in this story is that in the process of servicing human life, so we have industrialized other forms of life. So there are more cattle on the planet than there would be naturally. There are more pigs on the planet than there would be naturally, because we need them. We have industrialized bird life. So the most populous bird is chicken, 31 billion, and of them, 21 billion are broiler chicken. The next most popular bird is an American bird. I forget the name, Ikela or something. That's 1.5 billion. So left to itself, maybe chickens would be 1.5 billion. But the fact that there are so many, now fish used to be a wild catch. And now we're industrializing the lives of fish. We're domesticating fish, in effect, by fish farming. 90% of farmed fish today comes from Asia, the bulk of it from China. And this was the year, this is the year when the total GDP of the global south exceeded that of the global north. So again, if you simply look at human history, then it is a story of progress. It is a story of the non-West finding a place at the high table of the world. China's rise, India's rise. We've had a relative time of peace. I mean, my life would be, I wouldn't have survived for this long without antibiotics, without peace, the absence of major wars. And so in a way, what we are seeing as climate problem is really that is the impact of our well-being and our freedom. So it's in that context, when you think of this history, the history of the blue graphs and the history of the orange graphs together, that's when you begin to see globe and the planet, right? And that's why I said it's not binary distinction. It's really the intensification of the globe. The fact that more people travel. And the pandemic happened because we live in congested city in bigger numbers, and most of us travel. And our lives are based on the infrastructure of travel. My son lives in Australia. My parents were in India. I had to live between 3 countries emotionally, right? I mean, the entire infrastructure, because in the last century, when we all globalized and moved from one country to another, the assumption was there'd be planes, they would be traveling, we'll see each other, that there wouldn't be the kind of emotional cost that the European settlers paid when, ships were slow, letters didn't come, all of those things, right? We didn't think that would happen, but anyway, so that's where the globe and the planet distinction. So this is just bringing the graphs forward. So now I'll go to the distinction quickly, and maybe then we can have a discussion. So as I said, the globe is human-made and humanocentric. The planetary is a human construct, but descent as the human. I won't explain that. I've already talked about it, right? So I assume that's clear, but we can come back, question time. The global belongs to the recorded history of 500 years. The planetary is about deep history, the geobiological history of the Earth system. So I was telling you, the oxygen story, without oxygen, we wouldn't live. The oxygen story is fascinating because the oxygen story goes back to 2.5 billion years ago, when algae, with producing photosynthesis, the air had more nitrogen. It still is majority nitrogen. But oxygen for creatures that depend on nitrogen, oxygen is just poison. So when there was more oxygen, in the air, a lot of nitrogen-fixing bacteria either died or were driven underground. And the scale of the disaster was such that geologists sometimes call the Great Oxidation Event oxygen holocaust. Just to give you an example. But without that oxygen holocaust happening, we wouldn't exist. So think of so that's kind of the planetary view puts you in a different perspective, right? And the globe is uniquely and singularly human. The planet is a comparativist category. Why do I say that? Because this question, and goes back to the Cold War. So when the space war began, space competition, as continuation of the hot war, and there's a whole question of, can Mars be made habitable for humans, particularly after the Americans had gone to the moon. And I still remember in Calcutta, growing up in high school, looking at a Time magazine with an American artist's impression of what Mars would look like once humans, meaning Americans, had gone there. And it would be no surprise to anybody here that Mars looked exactly like Manhattan in that artist's impression of a human colony. But when this debate was going on in NASA, NASA employed this British scientist, James Lovelock, who came up with the Gaia idea. He worked with NASA in Carl Sagan's unit between 1961 and 66. And he made up, and they were all trying to figure out, they didn't have a biologist in the team until Lynn Margulis, Carl Sagan's later estranged wife, joined the team. But they were all asking a biologist question. They were asking, okay, we're asking if Mars can be made inhabitable for humans, but what makes a planet habitable? What makes a planet friendly to life? And their sample size was, historian sample size, 1, right? This is the only planet we know. But they were trying to desperately generalize out of this planet. And the physicist Schrödinger had given a series of lectures in 1939 in Dublin, a fascinating series of lectures based on thermodynamics. It's called What is Life? So the question was popping up, what is life? And in that debate, somewhere, so the question became the voice comparative. So I was saying, why is Venus so hot? Why is Mars so cold? And why is this planet so friendly to first simple and then complex life for hundreds of millions of years? So they call it the Goldilocks planet. This is the planet where everything seemed to have worked for life, in spite of 5 great extinctions. And in this debate, how to start life off, suddenly James Lovelock had an insight reading about the history of life on the planet and said, forget about readying Mars for humans, just ready it for bacteria, and they will do the job. They were realizing that bacteria, the microbes, are really the foundation on which life rests. We are not the foundation, they are the foundation. They do the job of keeping life going. All forms of life that we think of as inferior forms of life. Without them, there would be no life. But you see, this question, why is Venus so hot? Why is Mars so cold? It's not a coincidence that James Hansen, the NASA scientist who broke the news to the US Congress, he was a student of Venus. And he used to ask this question, why is Venus so hot? And his answer was that Venus had experienced a runaway planetary warming. It had accumulated so much carbon dioxide that it became hot. And he says in his book, Storms from My Grandchildren, that he took 3 months leave from studying Venus to study this planet because he had a hunch that a similar thing was going on this planet. But then he never went back to study Venus, and he became a global warming activist because he realized the same thing was happening here. But that's why it's comparative. But it's comparative with a sample size of 1. That people are still looking for Earth-like planets here and elsewhere. And then when you think about it, then sustainability is a human-centric word. And even the Brundtland Commission's definition of sustainability is how one generation of humans will leave the planet in a sustainable state for another generation of humans. But habitability he refers to all forms of life. The planet being habitable for all forms of life. Again, it's not a human-centric. So the critical term in planetary studies is habitability. People still don't know what makes a planet habitable. They say the jury is out. But the question is there. And that's the question that drives astrobiology, the search for Earth-like planets, all of those things. And it's a fundamental question in answering the question, what is life? So the global is about a human dominant order of life. That is where we are at. Human beings now, as I said, we industrialize other forms of life, including bacteria and viruses we might culture in the labs to produce them. The planetary reminds us that humans are a minority form of life. After plants, the majority form of life, by numbers, are microbial. And I think by numbers, they may be even more than plants. They actually be the most major form of life. The majority forms of life are microbial. So if you think about a minority form of life dominating the hell out of other forms of life, if all forms of life were human, if everybody was human, this would sound like apartheid. But it's because it's other forms of life. We don't think in terms of apartheid. But it is something that's interesting to think through. This is really pictures giving you, fleshing out the biomass of different forms of life. Another interesting thing is, of course, following from, this is a debated pie chart, but one of the things you see is one of the critical things is now that you've got 8 billion people, you have to feed them. And one of the critical questions today is, can we feed such a large number of humans without modern agriculture? But modern agriculture is destructive. And one of the interesting, now these figures are disputed, by the way. That's why I should say that other scientists, there's been a debate in that journal and elsewhere about that article. So don't take the figures as exact. They may be wrong, but at least you get some idea that pesticides themselves contribute 12.6% to the decline of insects worldwide. So the pesticides don't just kill the insects you want to kill, they also kill other insects. And insects are critical to agriculture. So it's just trying to show you the multidimensional nature of that problem. And okay. And so the globe, Earth, and the world are about mutuality. The planet does not return our gaze. The simple example that I will give to you is, again, to decenter human, is to think about oxygen. The oxygen story is fascinating. So we all breathe oxygen. Without oxygen, we're all gone. The air at the moment has 21% of the air is oxygen. If there were more oxygen in the air, everything would go up in flames, or they would be more inflammable. If there was less oxygen in the air, we will choke to death. So there is the question of maintaining this level of oxygen. And the problem with maintaining oxygen in the air is that if you've done any chemistry, you'd know that oxygen is a highly reactive gas. It doesn't stay on its own. It mixes up. So you have to keep supplying the air with fresh oxygen. And who supplies the air with fresh oxygen? Oxygen is supplied by plants, by bacteria, and a large portion, like 50%, by phytoplanktons, which are like algae-like sea creatures, plants of a form, right? They supply 50%. And they have supplied the oxygen in a way where oxygen has never gone up so high that the forest all burnt up, never gone down so low that animals choke to death. And the number of years for which they have managed to maintain this level of oxygen is 375 million years. So that's my story with oxygen. So if you think about the oxygen that we so critically depend on, this air was not made for us, with us in mind. This air was made with all kinds of creatures, if there was a mind, right? And we are the beneficiaries of it. We don't contribute to the maintenance of oxygen. And that is what I mean by one-way street. And that's what I mean by saying that it's not like the planet was made for us and there's a beautiful fit between humans and the planet. We tend to think that. But actually, we are not the end of this creativity that went on in this planet. Then we can come back to the point later if you want. And so that's why I say the globe is moral political. So we created the globe, and the globe lends itself to questions of justice. Yeah, thank you. So the globe is moral political, but the planet reduces us to our creaturely lives. I take the word creaturely from the biblical sense of it. And one quick example I'll give you was during the 2021 firestorms in Australia. The South Australian government took a decision to hire gunship helicopters to take out 10,000 feral camels. Because the camels were competing with a group of humans for fresh water. And you see, so when there's a survival is not politics. Every creature will want to survive. So when I think of those helicopters as kind of giving us, bigger claws and bigger muscles to deal with the camels. The camels themselves have a fascinating history in terms of colonization of Australian empire. So the globe is moral political. The planetary reduces us. They can reduce us to our creaturely lives. So technology, urbanization, and the marginalization of the season and the weather. Again, basically, I argue that the growth of cities based on modern technology, this is something we were discussing a little bit this morning, led to a certain kind of marginalization of the seasons. I mean, if you think back to peasant society or indigenous society, whether it rained or whether the sun was too strong, was a life and death question. Seasons were a life and death question, right? Every peasant society, so many of the rituals are tied to harvesting. Whereas in modern societies, there's a distance between seasons and us, and that is partly the kind of forgetting that happens. The planet is both macro and micro, so it's just the whole huge scale, but also the microbes in your body, the microbiome. So I actually say that when you had the pandemic, the human part of the pandemic, where it spread, was global, but the viral part of the pandemic was planetary, right? The virus was evolving in a Darwinian sense. The planet is not the same as nature, because the planet involves, the Earth system involves thinking about places that humans never inhabit, deep oceans, oceanic currents, the ozone layer, the Siberian permafrost. So when we think of nature, usually we use nature as something that indexes human experience. But this is like, it doesn't index human experience. And the last thing I say is the personal is not only political, that's what we learned in the 70s, it is also planetary. And I'll just quickly say this and finish. So just to give you one example, what we're running out of in the world is sand. So there's a crisis with sand because India, China, and the United States are three countries with a construction boom. So if you think purely in India, in human terms, China is pulling people out of poverty, creating housing for them. Same in India. But when you build, you can't build with desert sand. The desert sand is shaped into spherical grains by the wind. And these spherical grains don't bind together very well. So that's why you need sand either from the beach or from rivers. And I read in a technical article on sand that humanity is now using up sand at a higher rate than the rate at which sand is being created by the earth. But so if you look at, on the other hand, housing is a story of human welfare and consumption, all of those things. But our consumption, in which we all partake, is also now having planetary implications, given the scale of population that we can support and sustain, given the technology. So I'll end there. Thank you very much for your patience. and take any questions. Thanks, Jenny.
Thank you so much, Professor Chakrabarty, for that amazing lecture. Could you elaborate more on the connection between the globe of globalization and the globe of global warming? I'm specifically trying to know if in your thinking, if globalization as the spread of capital is ultimately responsible for the massive shifts at the planetary that we are witnessing. So this morning you talked about how, and right now you also said capitalism is not everything, but I'm just trying to think about the link between the two types of globe.
That's planetary. Yeah. Okay. Mhm. So, so the first of all, as I said, we were becoming more and more aware of the planetary dimensions as, you might say, global capitalism spread, or as the desire for modernization was actually being realized in many countries. So I would say, now whether you call it capitalism or the desire for modernization, as I was saying, in India and China, modernization was driven not so much by a dream of capitalism, but by the desire to feed everybody. Because they came out of very strong history of famines, both China and India, in 47 and 49. And the fact that, so now whether capitalism creates the desire for itself is both a philosophical and a different kind of question. Most people who think in terms of capitalism would say the very ideology of capitalism creates a demand for capitalism, therefore it's eventually capitalism. But it's very hard to know to what degree human desires are simply a product of something you call capitalism, or a product of demonstration effect. I mean, think of Japan, never been colonized. Japanese modernization was driven by a perception that modernization created powerful nations. In India and China, it was driven by the perception Nehru came to America in the 1950s. And this is kind of on the eve of Green Revolution. And there are pictures of Nehru in the Midwest looking at corn stalks and admiring the size of, and thinking, how can India do this? The entire ideology of dams and damming rivers was because that was the way they thought they would increase irrigation. Right? So, but Nehru was not thinking capitalism, he was thinking welfare. Mao was not thinking capitalism, but thinking welfare. Similarly, welfare economics, I mean, Pigu's book on welfare economics, 1930s, you will find he's thinking of economics as contributing to human welfare. What I might say is that by then, the idea of human welfare had become somehow separated from what we might today call planetary questions. Whereas in peasant societies or indigenous societies, you don't get terms like planetary and stuff, but there are, the way of life is, the way of living is such that the human realm doesn't expand in oblivion of the life support system of the planet, right? So I was saying this morning that there are more checks and balances in those kind of societies. But mind you, the indigenous societies were typically societies that supported small population. The reason why the British never thought they would produce settler colonialism in India was because India was already crowded for them. You know, they came to lands where they thought there was a lot of land and not enough people crowding the land. So that's why Australia, North America, these seemed to them like land they could occupy and settle and take over. But that's also because most indigenous societies supported, they had a lifestyle which supported smaller populations. And this is the problem. Can you support 8 billion people with that kind of society? Maybe not. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much. My name is Marco Dufal. I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Religion. So thank you so much for this really informative and brilliant talk. So I was really interested by the way you developed this concept of decentering. So I have read Sulaiman Bashir Jain, but he's using it in
an African philosophy context.
Yes.
Yeah, right.
And also, but language and culture.
Yeah.
So, but for Bashir, it's more or less about appropriating a new set of culture.
Right.
So that is a new modus operandus. So what is the modus operandus of this one?
So what
is the modus operandus of your own repositioning, how it functions, and how is that repositioning? Because it's about decentering the human.
So what I'm saying is that the sciences are also decentering the human. The Earth system science is a branch of science where, because geology and evolution biology are so important, and they are subjects that already decenter the human, because the humans come very late, too late in the story to be at the center. So that's why, I mean, I think for me, someone who says it very beautifully is Achille Mbembe. He's from Senegal, but lives in South Africa, and where he says humans belong to a very long history. They belong to a very long history, which in no sense can be called their own. Right? So that's deep history for me. In other words, deep history is a history shared between different forms of life. But you can't say it's just human history. And it's developing this perspective alongside the perspective of capitalism, the perspective of welfare, which are completely human-centered stories. They're stories about, see, this is why the problem in politics is that to know that we're all human beings, we all accept that we're all the human species, probably evolved in Africa, spread elsewhere. That knowledge does not itself produce a political subject. It actually produces division between humans. So when Sartre wrote his preface to Fanon, The Wretched of the Earth, he has a very beautiful sentence where he says, it is precisely because I recognize you as a human being that I humiliate you. I oppress you. I make a slave out of you. I don't do it to an animal. Right? So his argument is that it is that human recognition of one human being, of another human being as human, does not by itself guarantee a progressive politics. It can lead in the completely opposite direction. Right? But Mbembe's statement, which I find is beautiful, he says humans belong to a very long history that in no sense can be called their own, but they belong to it. And it's that sense of scales of belonging. So this is a scale of belonging which doesn't produce identity. Whereas my scale of belonging to Bengali society produces identity. I say I'm a Bengali. Right? My knowledge that I belong to the human species does not produce an identity. All I know then is that it's a branch that comes off the primate families. The old world monkeys are even older. Right? I mean, but on the other hand, if I have that knowledge, it definitely changes what I do. It changes my relationship to the world. So that's why I'm saying the planetary, even the scientific planetary, decenters the human. This is a modern way of decentering human compared to, say, the indigenous way of decentering human. I mean, totemistic cultures decenter humans, or at least they place humans and animals on the same plane. Right? I mean, Durkheim argued this many sort of decades ago. So, but the interesting thing I find is a convergence between modern science and these forms of thought. They're all speaking of entanglement. It's political thought that's lagging behind, because political thought doesn't know how to make politics out of the knowledge of the entanglement in modern institutions like parliament. Now for instance, now there are some countries which have given legal standing to trees or rocks or plants. There are some countries. But the difficult question is the question of representative. So within, let's say, electoral representative democracy, right? Representation is based on proportion or something, like some calculation of numbers. But here, often political theorists pointed out that if you create parliamentary representation as distinct from legal advocates for a rock or a plant, you create a permanent minority in the parliament. So what's lagging behind is our own political thought, because political thought has been based exclusively, modern Western political thought, have been based exclusively on human-centeredness. And when Collingwood was saying only humans have history and things don't have history, he was both right and wrong. Because see, that separation again goes back to in early 19th century, in the Hegelian terms, to the distinction between the position that said nature is the realm of necessity. Nature is subject to its own laws. Humans are in the domain of necessity and freedom, because they're not covered by iron laws, like natural laws, right? So this investment, this Western investment in the conception of freedom, which was based on a separation of the natural world from the human world, it becomes a problem when humans grow in number, in technology, and claim the same separation to justify their own progress, right? So there's a scale question. Right? If there were few human beings, like let's say go back to 1900, making this claim, the impact, given the technology and numbers, wouldn't have been so deleterious. So it is through the environmental degradation of the world that we find out what the environment is and what it does for us. And with the discovery of the microbiome, we realize that the distinction is not between an organism and its environment outside. Your environment, your microbial environment, is both inside you and outside you. I mean, there are zillions of bacteria and viruses inside you, keeping you going. Most of them are friendly, right? So that's why, again, Ashil's statement, I love it. He says, human beings belong to a very long history, which in no sense is their own. So that's the decentering that I was trying to say.
So I was definitely intrigued by your separation or the distinction between the globe and the planet. But I'm
not separation. They're connected, not separation. One allows you to see the other.
The distinction then between their definitions.
It's an analytical distinction between the two because it gives you two different perspectives. Remember Kant's question, what is the human being? So I'm saying the planet allows us to see ourselves from a different perspective to what the globe gives us.
Okay. Yeah. So then my question for you is, why do you think this, or having these two definitions and seeing their connections and how they interact, why do you believe that's such an important thing to recognize?
Is it any use? I mean, what use is it?
Why is it important?
That's a very good question. So, the position I was taking in my book was to say, here's the distinction I propose, you find out if it's useful. I was not going to say this is why it's useful. But since you asked the question, I feel obliged to answer the question. So I would say there are two ways to go. So I have a colleague now who is trying to, a physicist, who has been given a lot of money and support to see if humans can change the climate of the whole planet, control it, reduce the temperature of the world by 2 degrees of the whole world. Now that's kind of accepting we are a planetary force and we are going to tell sun that it can't shine so bright. So we're going to put aerosol in the stratosphere, use fighter planes. And then basically these aerosol particles will reflect sunlight back. So you have scattered light. Remember the moments, there are times when the sun looks almost white. this is what the sky will look permanently. But that's kind of saying, yes, we are not just global, we are planetary, and we'll create planetary technology. Some people have suggested that we should actually create contraptions that will capture the sunlight, the energy of the sun that escapes the planet, goes past. So we'll capture it and bring it here. So this is like doing the work of the clouds and so that's one way to go. So David Keith will probably say to me, yes, good, you've said, Dipesh, that we are planetary, and I'm going to make us even more planetary. Whereas there's the other position like Edward Wilson, the biologist, who used to say, we should not become planetary because we depend on biodiversity and the way the work that the microbes do. We are not central to this planet. We should scale our operations back and let humans just reflect the fact that we're a minority form of life. So that I don't say this in the book. I give them as two examples. But I also think that humans, the one fundamental aspect of being human is to disagree. So I never think humans will have one consensus on the crisis. And I think all I can do as somebody who thinks about it is to put forward a point of view, put forward a distinction, and then let humans decide what, if it feels relevant, then they'll do something with it. My book is called The Climate of History in a Planetary Age. So I was doing two things. As a historian, I was saying, no longer are we simply in the age of globalization. We are in an age which is in excess of globalization. We're also in a planetary age. We're transitioning to a planetary age. We don't know what that will mean, but we are no longer just in the world that we understood as global, which was human-centric. And the second thing was, also I was saying that since politics is grounded on human difference, so there are two ways to go. So Carl Schmitt, the German political philosopher, said, humanity is not a universe, it's a pluriverse, right? So it will always debate and argue. Hannah Arendt thought that it is in the fact of our wanting to debate and argue that there's always room for new ideas and changes. So for Hannah Arendt, this was an optimistic fact that humans argue. For Carl Schmitt, it was not so optimistic. It meant there'd be wars, there'd be friends and enemies and those kind of distinctions. But it goes back to a statement that Aristotle makes in Nicomachean Ethics, where he actually says that humans exchange things because they're different. So he thinks the very basis of human coming together is difference. It is because you have something that I don't have that we exchange things, even socially, right? So therefore, Aristotle thought on the ground there's only difference, and the task of politics is to bring people together around and across these differences, right? So, but we have so far done so in European political thought by abstracting humans from the world. Now, because there's so much environmental degradation, we realize that we can't abstract ourselves from the world. So we now, in bringing us together, we also have to think about our relationship to other forms of life. Okay? So that's why the distinction seems useful. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you for the talk. That was fantastic. I want to go back to the first questions about capitalism, and
sure.
and because I was intrigued by your kind of conceptual differentiation between welfare capitalisms and modernizations just now during the questions, and I just would like if you could elaborate a little bit more about the questions of the place of capitalisms in this, because it seems to me that there is a problems of the drive of expansions of capitalism, the reluctancy of like accepting any forms of limit, and of course, the problems of the planetary. It seems to me to still relying on the questions of a limit of capitalism, because of course capitalism, it's not driven by the satisfactions of needs. It's not driven by human beings.
Capitalists are not driven by satisfaction needs. That's true.
It's driven by that need of constant expansion, and that's why at a certain problem, the planet start to pose a limit for this. You know, we see it in the last few years with the great infrastructures and real estate bubbles. You know, we construct houses which are not, no one lives in those houses anymore. You know, and it just because, to go back to the first questions of what is a human being and the Kant questions, it seems to me that if we want to rely on a forms of anthropology that it's driven by this self-propelled drive of expansion,
Capitalism.
yes,
Yeah.
capitalisms, or the human being that is constructed by capitalisms in a way.
This is where. So the question is, to what degree humans are constructed by capitalism?
Exactly.
Right? So
exactly.
So in my recent book, I cite as an example a peasant woman in Himachal Pradesh, which is up north in India, being interviewed by Norwegian anthropologists around 2012. And she's 20, not married yet. And she's asked, so do you think your children will live in the village? And she said, no, I want my children to live in cities. And said, why? So answer is very interesting. She said, in the city, you can cook standing up. Because in the village, as in my childhood, women had to sit like this, cook, right? And that's hard on your knees and everything. And so that's the first reason she gives. So her physical degree of well-being. Second reason, she says that when my husband's older brother comes to see me and I have to make him a cup of tea, I don't have to pull one end of my sari over my face to cover it. In the city, people don't do that. Freedom, certain kind of gender equality. The third reason she gives, which I also fascinating, she said, in the city, if you don't feel like cooking one evening, you can eat out. Now, is this woman being constructed by capitalism? I mean, she's clearly, of course, her desires are molded by what she knows of the city. But these are, if you forgot about environmental degradation. So in the 1980s, 90s, we welcomed these statements. And Ambedkar, who was the leader of the Dalits, is on record several times saying, I don't want villages, I want modern industrial cities. So there is a kind of understanding of human welfare, which is independent of support for capitalism. And I think that's a major factor of 20th century, and some of my Chinese historian friends would argue that the developmental state begins in China in the 18th century, independently. And one of the arguments for the historians of the early modern period is that infrastructure building picks up in the 18th century for many complicated reasons. That's why I think it goes back. See, as you know, it's very difficult with the usual Marxist understanding of ideology, even as one as complicated as Althusser's, which has a Lacanian understanding, and Fred Jamison's in The Political Unconscious. But they still see, it's very hard to avoid the distinction between the scientific understanding of the observer and the false understanding of the person being observed, right? And that distinction seems so questionable to me, apart from its elitism and arrogance and everything else. So I think it's, so, you know, that debate in the 1980s when Deleuze famously said, in that conversation with Deleuze and Foucault that Gayatri criticizes him, where Deleuze famously says that our interests find themselves where our desires are, right? Whereas the Marxist position would be, our desires find themselves where our interests are, right? And he completely reverses it. And I think, at least I can say that this is an unsolvable problem put in those terms. You can't solve the problem in the binary. It will always be on, it becomes an either or question, and it's not. And that's where I think we need a more complicated understanding of desire, the history of desire and capitalism, mass desires for well-being. And the second question, as I was saying in this morning, is that now the Earth system scientists say that human institutions are now embedded in the Earth system. Earth system is distributed causality. So I think once you find this environmental degradation on such a large scale, as we call the climate crisis, there is no final cause in operation, which is not to exonerate Exxon from having found out about global warming, having hidden the fact, right, from people, as people have pointed out. So it's not to exculpate the capitalists from all their evil and bad doings. But if you take into account India and China and look at the desire for modernization coming out of the lowest strata of society, it would be very hard to argue that they're being molded by American capitalism.